Welcome to the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee's first meeting of 2020. Before we move to the first item on the agenda, I've got a couple of housekeeping things to mention. Can I remind everyone to either switch off their mobile phones or put them on silent? They tend to affect the broadcasting system. And also, just for our participants in our roundtable discussion, you don't have to touch any of the consoles because broadcasting or they operate the microphones for you, so you have to worry about that. I'm going to go around the table and ask all of our guests to introduce themselves, just say who you are and who you're representing. We have a number of Parliament clerks and staff around. They won't be introducing themselves, but I also want to mention that we have our advisor to the committee on this area of our deliberations, Professor Colin Reid, as well. Colin won't be taking part in the discussion because he's here in advisory capacity as well. So I'll start to my right. Obviously we've got members as well, but we'll bypass the members because we get to speak and people should know who we are by now. And we'll start with Professor James Harrison.
Professor James Harrison, Edinburgh Law School.
Vicky Swells, I'm Head of Land Use Policy for RSPB Scotland.
Hattie Owens, I'm a lawyer in Klein Earth's UK Environment team.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Campbell Gemmell. I'm here not in any specific capacity or affiliation, but I was the author of the Link report on environmental governance issues and previously chaired the roundtable that was established, or the roundtable subgroup that was established by the Cabinet Secretary to look into these issues.
I'm Sheila George. I'm the Food and Environment Policy Manager at WWF Scotland.
Hello, I'm Nick Halfide. I'm Director of Sustainable Growth at Scottish Natural Heritage, and I've been taking an overview of our preparations for EU exit.
Annalisa Savarese, Spice Fellow and University of Stirling Senior Lecturer in Environmental Law.
Hi, I'm Joanna Waddle, Environment Lawyer from CMS, back here today representing the UK Environment Law Association.
Hi, I'm Lloyd Austin. I'm a freelance environmental policy analyst, and today I'm here representing Scottish Environment Link, of which I'm a fellow and convener of the governance group.
I'm Bridget Marshall. I'm Head of Regulatory Strategy and Government Relations at SEPA, and I've also been the lead for the organisation on our EU exit preparations.
Okay, so I should mention, obviously, this is a process. We are going to exit the EU on the 31st of January. The withdrawal agreement bill has passed, and there were significant changes to that withdrawal agreement bill as debated compared to its previous iteration, which effectively all the environmental parts of it were taken out, and I suppose I kind of want to use that as a springboard to start discussion about maybe your reaction to that and what that potentially might mean in terms of environmental governance and what you would like to see happen now as we get to a point where we definitely are exiting and we have all the attendant governance changes happening. So if anyone just wants to indicate to me when they want to speak, just in general, and I'll take your reaction to that. Would anyone like to go first? I'm sure you must all have when you saw it going past, you must have had a view. Lloyd Austin.
Mr. Stevenson's encouraging me to contribute, so I will. Yes, I think any form of EU exit will create some form of governance gap because all parts of the UK have benefited from various mechanisms that exist as a result of the work of the Commission, of the ECJ and European agencies like the European Environment Agency. So we benefit in a range of environmental activities that are carried out at a pan-EU basis, from monitoring and reporting through to monitoring implementation and scrutiny of implementation, as well as investigation of complaints and judicial oversight. And the lack of those activities was something that NGOs christened the governance gap in the early days of Brexit discussion. And, you know, in many ways, we're very pleased that all governments across the UK have acknowledged that that gap will exist if and when we leave completely. And there is an issue of what happens during the transition period, the 11 months, the 11 months from February to December this year. But certainly at the end of December, if we leave completely, that gap will be in existence unless there's something put in its place. And I think the important thing to try and assess is what should be put in its place within each of the jurisdictions, given that most of the environmental issues are devolved. And the Scottish Government subgroup did do quite a detailed analysis of those issues as to what they should be. And then the Link report built on that. I think the key test will be what form of sort of scrutiny and oversight exists. And I think the key test for those types of scrutiny and oversight things would be issues to do with independence of that scrutiny and oversight, the powers of whatever body carries out that scrutiny and oversight, and the resources available to it. So independence, powers, and resources would be the three key things that I would say are the important issues that need to be addressed in terms of whatever mechanisms are created to fill that governance gap. And I think that is drawn out in Professor Gemmell's report that the Link published at the end of last year.
Yeah. Professor Gemmell.
Happy to say more about that. I suppose before I lose it from my own mind, the other very obvious thing for me that the most recent statements have indicated on the developments in the bill, they tell us that non-regression is being forgone or whatever. And I think in terms of keeping pace with the EU, depending on how far into the future we look, that is potentially one of the biggest risks that is now before us, that we are, in a sense, going to lose sight of that which is happening over the rest of the European continent. But in terms of the arrangements, there has been a lot of traffic to and fro, some of it behind the scenes, in terms of the OEP, or the Office for Environmental Protection, and its scope, and how it's constructed, how independent it would actually be, how it would be resourced, etc., and what is devolved and what is reserved in terms of the whole UK model. And if it's not independent, and if it is involved in Scottish business, and if there is a change in the way in which policy is implemented, or the nature of that policy itself across the UK nations, then there's clearly significant risk of oversight taking on a new format and being operated differently from the way it has been hitherto. So the report that I did for Link, much like the work that had previously been done, did highlight the kind of gaps that Lloyd was describing. And I was certainly looking at global best practice and the way in which the New Zealand model gives us this parliamentary commissioner, an independent commissioner, and the role that that can play, if adequately resourced and adequately empowered, to handle complaints and to deal with other investigation issues, and then ultimately, as the sort of final station on the journey of environmental governance, having a dedicated specialist expert environment court. However great or small the business load of that would be, it gives that equivalent of the CJAU, which sits above the rest of the arrangements. And if the top of the system we would have under the new proposed UK arrangements is, in a sense, the OEP and that which we already have, we're, most of us, I think, very clear that that represents a very significant continuing gap, and that therefore that has to be addressed somehow. So dedicated arrangements in Scotland that would have those three components: the watchdog element of the parliamentary commissioner, the dedicated environment court, and actually a significant assessment of the status quo ante in order to ensure that if there is any fundamental further re-engineering of the arrangements we've got, that is actually undertaken. Because if you move one bit of this setup, it is possibly going to have knock-on impact elsewhere within the arrangements.
Right. I mean, I'm always very conscious that there's ordinary Scots watching this. And we're talking in a lot of very like jargonistic terms about what we're talking about. We do that because we're familiar with them. But what does this, not having any kind of like court in place to deal with environmental protections, what could that mean to the person in Scotland? I mean, how would that impact in their lives? What could possibly happen as a result of that?
Others may want to offer their views on this. From my point of view, if something is not being legally delivered, if the government itself is not observing the law, if an individual feels that they are being disadvantaged, if something has happened to them that they wish to complain about, who do they complain to? Now, at the moment, Link members and others have been looking at the ways in which environmental rights can be reinforced. So it could be a local planning case. It could be something that has been overwritten or overruled, or it could be something that has even gone to a reporter, or the government has already looked at something and decided that it's either supporting or rejecting the case made by a developer. If the public is still aggrieved about that, where do they go? So it's not as if we're trying to put in place something overweening and overarching that stops all business and becomes a great bureaucratic burden. It's about having in extremis the mechanism whereby if you are wronged or feel you are wronged, you have an avenue to pursue this. Also, government, and I used to be a part of a government agency in my role as Super Chief Exec for 9 years or so, it is not always in an agency's interest to make all information about everything publicly available. Sometimes the agency doesn't even have that information, so there are issues there as well. But as far as the member of the public is concerned, they want to know what a regulated entity is or isn't doing. Is it legally compliant? Is it doing what it said it was going to do? Is the minister holding that entity to account? Has Audit Scotland said they are doing something well or badly, or efficiently or inefficiently? Do I, as a citizen, have any rights at all to question that, to pursue that? And so, at the moment, there's a vanishingly small number of cases that move from first appeal, as it were, all the way to getting before the second circle of the Court of Justice of the European Union. But there are a lot of checks and balances in between that allow the citizen some access. Now, actually, our current arrangements are not fully Aarhus compliant, so there are issues of weakness there as things stand, which is why my third dimension needs to be explored, the robustness of the existing system. But the first and second components that are effectively replacing or substituting the existing European Commission and the Court of Justice mean that we have this redress option. We can actually, as citizens, go chase something and find out what really happened. Is it legal? Do I have rights? If we take the top of that away, we are wholly dependent then upon the robustness of the internal Scottish/UK system. And the imperfections of that are currently serious and could become far more serious.
I'm going to bring in Sheila George first.
Can just follow up on that and then go back to your original question, if that's okay. I think some of the other examples of how citizens might want to get involved if a government or a statutory agency isn't undertaking action, for example, on air quality or water quality, things that really impact people. At the minute, the EU Commission allows them free and accessible opportunities to take up a complaint, and in the absence of that, we know specifically we're feeling on Aarhus on those things. It's the affordability and the accessibility of citizens' access to environmental justice, and that's one of the gaps that would have to be plugged by whatever future governance arrangements come forward. But just on your original question about whether we're disappointed to see some of the environmental provisions fall out, of course we are, but that makes it even more important that Scotland brings forward its own strong governance arrangements. And we know from the original iteration of the Continuity Bill that was within Scottish competence, that we can do that, and nothing is stopping Scottish Government and Scottish Parliament bringing those provisions forward. So that's where we can get into the detail of the kind of things that Lloyd and Campbell have covered.
Yeah. Professor Harrison.
I think there are obviously, we're all in agreement there are going to be significant gaps from leaving the EU. I think we shouldn't lose sight of a potentially bigger picture here about just generally improving environmental governance. Firstly, the EU procedures were not perfect. The Commission exercised a lot of discretion in deciding which complaints it took forward, and I think we would want a much more transparent process designed at the national level. But also, the Commission could only, consider complaints about implementation of EU environmental law, and there were always gaps about compliance with purely domestic law, and we want a system that covers everything. And I think it's really important we keep that bigger picture in mind when thinking about how we move forward after we've left the EU.
Vicky Swales, I think you wanted to come in as well.
Well, just, one point at this point, which we may come on to in terms of more detail, just in terms of those governance arrangements, making the distinction between the requirements for a watchdog, as we might call it, and the difference between an environmental court or being able to take legal action thereafter. And we may come on to discussing some of the detail of that, but there are two different things. There's a watchdog function, and then there's potential for an environmental court and being able to take legal action against a government.
Nick Halfhide.
Would it be helpful if I gave some examples of what we've achieved through the European intervention? Just very briefly, I can give you three from my area of work. One is an intervention to require the UK to designate SACs for harbour porpoises. That came out of a European intervention. Secondly, an intervention to make sure that right across the UK, but this in Scotland as well, that we have site-specific conservation objectives for our European designated sites. That came out of a European intervention. And at a site-specific level in Ayrshire, at the Muirkirk and North Lowther SPA, which was an old open-cast mine, the intervention from Europe forced Scotland as a whole to do some restoration work that it wasn't planning to do. So those are three examples from the nature area where Scotland has taken action that it wouldn't otherwise have done because Europe told us to do so. If I could also have a second point, which is a broader point and picks up on some of the points here. Like all of us, it's a bit of a roller coaster, Brexit, and it continues to be so. We hear a bit coming out of the Prime Minister here, changing his mind, but we don't know what he's going to do next week. So there's all of this going on. My immediate reaction when I heard all that was to slightly sit back from it and think, well, what do we all want to achieve here? Because Brexit is going to continue to roller coaster. What we need to do is plan for a decade of success. So this needs to be a decade of ecological restoration, and so we need mechanisms that's going to achieve that. There's a sense that in previous decades we've stopped things getting worse. That's not really good enough, and the Cabinet Secretaries recognise that. Whether it's ecological restoration, whether it's climate change, the two are linked. We need to plan to succeed in the next decade, not just to hold the line. And I think whether it's the principles we look at here or the governance, they need to have that goal in mind.
Okay, Annalisa Savarese.
I wanted to make a couple of observations in addition to those that are already contained in the brief I prepared for today's meeting. The one was concerning Professor Harrison's point on the possibility of doing better. There is an outstanding issue of compliance with environmental rights under international obligations of the UK and the Aarhus Convention. So clearly there is an opportunity here to move beyond judicial review and all its shortcomings, and whether or not that means establishing a court is of course largely a political decision, and there is many in this room that have voiced opinions on that. But regardless of whether a court is established, clearly there is a gap there that needs to be addressed in the context of enforcement, and there is many that have been saying this on both sides of the border for a while now. The other issue that was important, I believe, to flag is concerning the level playing field, because there was an understanding up to a point that there would be a level playing field between the EU and the UK. And now that the position of the UK government on this has changed, it's very important for Scotland to understand what this means for its plans, especially to keep pace with EU standards on environmental matters, because there are challenges there, and they flagged these in the brief, but I think this is really new compared with what we've been discussing so far on this matter.
Okay. Hattie Owens.
Thanks. I wholeheartedly agree with much of what's been said across the range of issues we've discussed. One particular point to pick up on, which Annalisa mentioned there, is in particular the enforcement gap. So whilst the governance proceedings are really crucial, and the oversight and the monitoring and all of those things, it's also really important that at the end of that process, if it's found that actually environmental law isn't being complied with, there are serious potential sanctions and remedies in place which act as a deterrent against continued non-compliance. And we see that through the EU infraction proceedings which are available with their daily fines. It's not that fines should always be the measure that's used, but I think it's really significant that that potential is there at EU level, and that's something that should certainly be thought about replicating at the domestic level as well.
I'm going to come to Bridget Marshall and then Lloyd Austin after that. Bridget.
A few more points on the bigger picture. I think it is really important to think about this in the context of the bigger picture. So from SEPA's perspective, as Nick has said, this is a really, really important decade. We've got climate emergency, we've got biodiversity loss, and we've got overuse of resources, and that's what we need to tackle really, really urgently. And it seems to us that there are two issues here in terms of governance. There's an immediate need to plug gaps from leaving the EU, and those gaps are recognised and are largely around scrutinising government and around access for citizens to the complaints procedure. But we also need a much more extensive think about the governance that we need to take us forward over that next decade to tackle those issues. And it seems to SEPA that there are two things here that we need to think about quite carefully, and that perhaps the plugging of the gaps for EU, which needs to be done on quite a short timescale, could be done quite quickly and in quite, and I'm not being sort of derogatory about this, in a quite light touch way, but having an eye to a much larger look at our governance, which would take us forward as a nation that needs to tackle these issues.
And a strategy of what we actually want to achieve, as I say, not just sort of like doing the minimum,
yes.
but actually having a strategy underpinning it all.
And, and in terms of how we're viewing things at the moment, the law that's set out is the minimum that we expect business to achieve. We have our regulatory strategy, One Planet Prosperity, that is working with business to get them to achieve much, much more. And to tackle those three big issues that I've talked about, we have got to get business motivated to tackle and go way, way beyond the law, to go beyond compliance. And that's a voluntary space that we operate in at the moment. But it seems to me that the law is becoming a backstop and is really the minimum we're expecting people to do. So we don't want to tie all our governance arrangements up in achieving the minimum. We want to inspire and get people moving way, way beyond what's legally required at the moment.
A number of members are wanting to ask questions. I am taking note of who wants to ask next, but I'm going to give our guests a chance first. Lloyd.
Convener, just a couple of supplementaries to what I said earlier, partly in response to your question about what does this mean for the individual citizen, individual Scot. And I think it's important to remember that the interventions that Nick described, which I completely agree with, that they were, and there are other examples as well, both in the nature area and beyond. The EU didn't intervene just of its own accord. It intervened in response to those issues being raised with it by individual citizens or associations of citizens, community groups or NGOs and so forth. So they are, those governance mechanisms are something that benefits, as Campbell was describing, people who feel that their local environment isn't being properly treated, or the environmental issue about which they care is not being addressed by the government or its agencies. And, you know, I think that leads us on to the question of citizens' rights. And I think this whole debate needs to take place in parallel with and cognizant of the work of the First Minister's Task Force on Human Rights Leadership. which is led by Professor Alan Miller, and they include within their range of human rights that they are considering environmental rights and the rights of citizens to environmental justice. And I think, ensuring that those two processes understand each other and complement one another will be important. And our final point is that all of this is achieves nothing unless the bodies and the courts or whatever system of governance you have has, as Hattie says, appropriate remedies, a full range of remedies that address the issue that's been raised, so that the environmental problem that has been highlighted, the environmental issue is addressed, not that some process point is addressed, but so that the pollution is prevented or cleaned up, the habitat is restored or whatever, so that the environmental outcome is a key focus of the remedy.
Okay, thank you. Right, we've got some members want to ask some questions. Finlay, you were first to get in there.
I would like some opinions on whether it's realistic, looking forward, that we can look at keeping pace and Scots law actually being able to deliver keeping pace when we look at the UK dissolved and reserved issues over the internal market and external markets and so on. But I was interested in what Nick said about we should be concentrating on a decade of success. So that raises the question, do we need to, in Scotland, look at the policies to deliver that decade of success and then go to the UK government and ensure that fits within a UK framework? Or is it the other way around? Where do we start? The chicken and the egg. Do we decide that what we need and then make sure the UK government understand the framework has got to be flexible enough to accommodate what we're looking for in terms of keeping pace and so on?
Nick, on you go.
I'm no expert on this, but my where I would start from is to say, as a nation, we should set out where we want to be. If we're clear where we want to be, it's a bit like how we've approached climate change as a nation, to say, this is our ambition. We set out our ambition, and then we'll work out how we're going to get there. I think there's a danger, and I think Bridget alluded to it, that we look too much at the here and now, though that is important. We actually need to look further ahead and say where we'd want to be, how are we going to get there, and then we go to the UK government. We then look at European law, and do we want to keep pace with it? Maybe it's not ambitious enough for us. Maybe that's a minimum standard. I think these are questions we need to give our attention to and not be too unduly tied up in the fog that is Brexit at the moment.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. I mean, I think I'll answer both parts in terms of the keeping pace, but also setting out the ambition. So I think that brings us in a way to the need for an overarching environment strategy. And Bridget and Nick have both alluded to that in terms of, what does Scotland want to achieve in the longer term? So we've obviously seen some movement already by Scottish Government in terms of a consultation, and now expecting a sort of vision and outcomes for Scotland's environment to be published in February. But in a sense, we want something that is longer term, ambitious, and set some legally binding targets for the recovery of nature, which is very clear we need to do. We face a nature emergency. We have legally binding targets now to deliver in terms of a climate emergency. And of course, those two things are interrelated. Nature and nature-based solutions can actually help us tackle climate change. So we absolutely need to bring forward an ambitious environment strategy for Scotland, underpinned by legislation, I think, to secure real progress. We need to set out what our future goals are in a longer term. Nick mentioned 10 years, you could go further. We don't always want to cast our eyes south of the border, but they're setting out a 25-year plan for the environment. Some of the things that we're talking about will be long-term things that will take time to deliver. We need to make sure that's underpinned by an evidence base of where we are now and the science behind that. And we need a clear action plan setting out what we're going to do, when we're going to do it, how we're going to do it. And of course, Scottish Government ultimately will need to provide some funding to make all of that happen. But we really need that strategy, I think, to create that join up across all the sort of different departments and portfolios, which ultimately have some impact on or can deliver for an environment strategy. We may come on to some more aspects of that shortly, but one point I just wanted to make about the keeping pace question as well is that, in a sense, to me, those two things are partly separate to some extent. We're going to have to think about keeping pace right from the off, because immediately Europe is continuing to change all the time, legislation around the environment, around lots of other things. So that's an immediate question, never mind whether we then set our longer term strategy and ambitions, I think.
Okay. Sheila George.
Yeah, so just on the environment strategy, totally agree. And I think that what's going to be really key for that is to have a legislative underpinning. We know from the Climate Change Act, it set out interim targets and long-term targets. And then the climate plan, as being revised currently, will outline what different sectors have to do to help deliver that, and also a review of all policy to ensure that it's net zero proof and will help us get there. And I think we need exactly the same approach for nature and the environment. We just haven't had that step change in ambition that we've seen for climate, for the biodiversity crisis that we're facing. And where that legislation sits, I'm not sure. I think we had been calling for dedicated legislation in the form of an Environment Act, but we know that we may not get that now. So we would like some form of duty in the continuity bill, possibly, to bring forward legislation to underpin the environment strategy. I think that's going to be really key to ensure that we secure the outcomes when we know what those are. Yeah, I can't remember what my other point was.
We'll come back to you. Let me know when you remember. I'll come back to you. James.
So I think there are other influences beyond the EU we need to be aware of. 2020 is important because there's a big climate change conference being hosted in Scotland, but also the Convention on Biological Diversity is about to adopt a new 10-year strategy, and that will replace the so-called Aichi targets, which are coming to an end this year, with a hopefully new set of ambitious global targets for biodiversity. And it's this type of thing that we also need to be aware of in order to inspire the domestic action. So I think we need to be looking at the global picture as well as trying to figure out whether we want to be keeping pace with the EU, and take all of this into account in developing our Scottish strategy. I think a related point to that is, to come back to the original question, where things sit, whether they're UK, Scottish, is obviously complicated. There's no simple answer to that. It may depend on the issue. Many environmental issues have an international element to it. And I think what is essential is there is good cooperation between the UK and Scottish governments. And there are two aspects to that. One is political, and I won't comment on that, but I think there's an institutional element to cooperation, and I'm not convinced that the institutions that we have in place to facilitate that cooperation is currently fit for purpose. I think that's come up a lot during the Brexit negotiations. The Joint Ministerial Committee has not been working well, and I think we need to look at that UK institutional reform as well to make sure that our institutions and administrations are working at least in the same direction, even if there is divergence between the actual policy. They need to be cooperating.
Sheila.
I remembered my point. I think what's going to be really key is common agreement on minimum standards, so that the only way we can move forward is up the way. It provides the flexibility for Scotland to aim higher if it so wishes, but it means that the UK has agreement that there will be no rolling backwards on standards. That's going to be really key. We need to agree on, we may get to environmental principles in a minute, but we need to agree on the interpretation and the implementation of those environmental principles. Again, that's going to be key for ensuring how we interpret the law, and what cases we can take forward, etc. We need collaboration on purely practical terms in management of shared resources, cross-border water bodies, cross-border protected areas. And one of the other examples, we're going to need some level of cooperation. It will have implications for Scotland, as was in Annalisa's briefing on emissions trading schemes. So, for example, the climate change plan, it relies heavily on participation in EU emissions trading schemes. It's one of the key policies for reducing industry emissions. So it's one of the examples where decisions made at the UK level could influence Scotland's ambitions. So there are quite a few examples of that, but cooperation is really going to be a key across the board, but we need to ensure that we're creating a race to the top, not a race to the bottom.
Lloyd.
Thank you, Convener. Just a couple of additional points on keeping pace. I agree with a lot of what's been said, particularly the issue of not only keeping pace with Europe, but following best practice internationally. And one of the issues that I think needs to be linked to whatever keeping pace provision we have is some form of commitment to non-regression. Now, I know the Cabinet Secretary has given kind of a policy hint that non-regression is her ambition. And I think there has been some quite good international policy development about what non-regression is by people such as the IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, which is a UN-type body that involves governments and NGOs. And what it does is it links non-regression to environmental outcomes, not necessarily to the legal processes, but to the actual state of the environment. So that, as Sheila says, we can move upwards, but not downwards in terms of that state of the environment. And, you know, I think that, and also both in terms of non-regression and keeping pace, we need to recognise where Scotland has done actually better than some of the European minimums, such as on the Water Framework Directive. And, you know, we have done some things that are already better than European minimum, so we don't want to regress to that European minimum. We want to keep the ambitions high where we've set them high already, and maybe, as we've been saying in terms of the strategy, set them higher still in some areas.
Hattie?
Thank you. So on keeping pace, very much support that as a commitment. It's the kind of progressive and ambitious approach that our environment so desperately needs at the moment. Picking up on James's point around influences beyond the EU, 2020 is obviously a very significant year in terms of international environmental law, but another area of influence beyond the EU is the trade agreements that the UK government will be looking to negotiate over the next few months and years, and it's a very complicated issue, and the role of the Scottish Government there is complex, but I think just to highlight that it's really important the Scottish Government can investigate ways to continue to be ambitious and have a role in those negotiations. So to the extent that keeping pace is reflected in Scots law, then that is also part of the conversation and part of those negotiations. And then finally, just touching on Lloyd's point around non-regression, I think it's really important that non-regression is legislated for. It's slightly different to the 4 EU environmental principles we see already, but it's helpful for it to be included sort of within that cloud of things that need to be included within legislation. One of those reasons being that although we anticipate that the EU will continue to be progressive in its approach to the environment, there is a risk that the EU backslides. And so if you've got keeping pace plus non-regression, and those will have to be carefully thought about and carefully drafted, it's belt and braces, and you're providing a really strong base for Scotland to continue to progress and be world leading in environmental law and governance.
Okay, Joanna Waddle.
Just to say that as far as UK law are concerned, we certainly agree with what Lloyd said about non-regression and Hattie there. In fact, in the response to the consultation, UK law Scotland did suggest that non-regression be adopted as a principle in Scotland as part of that. That's on the back of the Scottish Government's commitments to maintain or exceed environmental standards post-Brexit, and their statement that the 4 principles will continue to sit at the heart of environmental law and policy. But we do wonder if a duty to have regard to environmental principles goes far enough, and that is not in itself a regression, that perhaps that duty should be stronger. It's not going to would perhaps result in a minister somewhere being able to ignore the principles in making a decision.
It strikes me trade deals has been mentioned as well, so we're going to have trade deals occurring at a point before we actually probably have any kind of environmental principles in place because they're not in the withdrawal agreement bill? I mean, anyone want to comment on maybe some of the risks there, Campbell?
I do think that is a serious issue, and I'm quite happy in a sense to be critical of the government from that perspective, in that we have been slow to harden up what could potentially be beneficial in this area. I think we've taken collectively rather a long time to come to a decision point, partly because we've been waiting to see what the whole Brexit shambles looked like and therefore work out a meaningful path through it. But I think we've lost quite a lot of time. When the original roundtable work was done, most of the key points that we're making again now were actually made then. It would have been good to progress with an environmental strategy at that point, and not even just the strategy, but to get the vision right, because a strategy is to do something. It is the deployment of the resources to deliver the intended outcomes. What are these intended outcomes? It would have been extremely helpful to see what Scotland's aspirations were, and I always go back to the example that the Swedes delivered 20-odd years ago in terms of their so-called 15, where they set out what the nation's objectives were for the next 50 years and actually have been working systematically towards that. We've had a number of opportunities to do that, and in fact Bridget and I were talking about the SEPA environmental strategy early on in SEPA's life, which was a really strong visionary document and helped to guide a lot of the practical 1-year, 3-year programmes that followed. But at this point, we are likely to be blown off track, I suspect, by trade deals, because we'll have to react to what they actually mean, both at the UK level and potentially for Scotland. So very quickly getting ourselves some hardened down, clear objectives and put them into a coherent vision framework, which of course can be amended subsequently, but getting that done now would be extremely constructive. We are losing time.
UK level.
Scottish and UK,
yeah.
yes, absolutely. Yeah. Again, going back to my and Scotland's experience in terms of regulatory practice and the way in which we've operated, there have been times where Scotland has had a very different context from the UK. And we've had times when the UK's submission of material to the EEA on environmental performance has left Scotland out because Scotland was inconveniently better or had a different set of arrangements. Or indeed the whole UK was left out of the report because Scotland looked rather good and England looked rather bad. There have been whole periods where we've had to tiptoe through this particular set of challenges. We are still there, but we are likely to be forced into a position, it seems to me, of having to work out what the potential consequences would be of a trade agreement that has environmental consequences that we don't have a protection for. So there is, in my view, there is no time to waste. We need to get on with having that clearer vision, having the strategy, and having the mechanisms to ensure that we can protect ourselves, or at least can know the nature of the problems that we are facing. We could be going into this fog without any particularly good navigation.
Yeah.
Yes.
Annalise. Yeah, that brings me to a quick point that I want to make earlier on the fact that EU law presently is the means through which we comply with many of the UK's international obligations on a number of environmental issues. So it has been flagged in some of the inquiries in Westminster that there is a risk of the UK sleepwalking into non-compliance because of lack of capacity to keep pace on some of these issues, ozone-depleting substances and chemicals being one of these. So again, the urgent need to build capacity somewhere in the UK in order to address these important, extremely technical issues that are really only for the experts is important and very urgent.
Yeah. I'm going to move on to another member's question to throw into the mix. But of course, you know, you might want to answer some of the other issues as well, and that's fine. Just raise your hand and I'll put you on the list. Stuart Stevenson, you had your hand up ages ago.
Yes, and do forgive me, I want to go back to structures. And essentially, I think I'm probably addressing Mr. Campbell-Gamble as much as anything. I'm assuming if we contemplate an environmental court, that will therefore be part of the court system and responsible to the Lord President. Yeah, getting that nod. And I just wondered whether, rather than an environmental court, we thought instead of an environmental tribunal. And I'm making the comparison with the Land Court and the Land Tribunal, and in particular because tribunals have different and wider rights of appearance and substantially lower barriers to being able to use them of cost and opportunity. And related to that, on the other side of the equation, essentially the custodians of the policies outside government, which is what I think was being proposed by a commissioner mechanism. And of course, I just wonder, because we have a number of bodies, SEPA, SNH, Marine Scotland, etc., who are responsible for policy and for administrative enforcement, which may lead to financial penalties, how that would work with that, how that fits together as a framework that actually makes the things we've just been discussing, actually what we do, work in the real world and allow people to get in there. So that was it.
Really good question, and I'm going to caveat right from the start that that wasn't my mission. In a sense, I was not asked to design what that future court-type system would be, and there was the significant consultation that ran 2015-16 that looked at views about Environment Court. I think it needs quite a bit of consideration. Again, it would need to be done potentially relatively quickly, depending on the need we perceive. But I don't think there is any component of the existing system that serves well enough to be modified into this space, if we were to conclude that the model used in New South Wales or in New Zealand was actually a desirable one. And I think I would also want to stress that in parallel with the comments about the value and nature of process from the Court of Justice of the European Union, it's designed only to deal with cases that cannot be resolved at an earlier point. So the pressure should continue to be down through the system in order to find modes of resolution at an earlier point and to force agencies and authorities actually to deal with those. But one of the real values that has been evident in the New Zealand and New South Wales systems in particular, and one or two others, is the role of court officers effectively doing preparatory work. Now, the independence of those officers and the powers that they have to investigate without fear or favour and to do that without any risk of being viewed as being part of the existing system, I think is one of the most powerful parts of the arrangement. So investigating officers, and I think I referred in the Scottish Planning and Environment Law Journal recently to the fact that during my career I had a number of tussles with COPFS where there were certain fiscals who had particular views about what was appropriate and what wasn't appropriate to discuss, and there were sheriffs who had different responses to what was happening at the point of disposal. But there is a rich area of discussion to be had there about how best to handle complaints. And addressing Lloyd's point, the focus through JRs and other parts of the pre-court system on the proper nature of a procedure rather than on the merits of the case has been a particular problem. And in New South Wales in particular, they have seriously focused on trying to identify the issue and then trying to find ways of resolving them. Passing cases often back from the court to a commissioner or to an agency under direction to resolve. So I do not want at this point to advocate the design of the court mechanism as our priority. I actually think getting the rest of the system right almost makes the court unnecessary. But the court has to exist with supreme power at the end of that process chain in order to be able to resolve that which has not previously been able to be resolved. Now, that might sound like a long-winded response trying to avoid your question. I'm not. I just think better minds than mine and more experienced individuals should be involved in designing what the court model needs to look like, but only having got the rest of the system right.
Hattie and then Lloyd.
I want to just go back quickly to principles, if that's okay, and particularly pick up on Joanna's point around the legal duty. the have regard duty, which is at least the current drafting in the Westminster Environment Bill, and also I think the proposal for the Scottish principles is weak, and we've seen that in relation to the Natural Environment and Rural Communities Act. It was heavily criticised by the Lord Select Committee, which investigated that Act in 2018. And this matters because the role of these principles is really broad as it stands through EU law at the moment. So they're locked in through the Lisbon Treaty, and they play a role in the development of policy. They're there for the case of individual administrative decision-making, also for legal challenge. So they have a broad and varied role. And it's really important that the legal duty is got right and that it's both sufficiently strong and sufficiently broad. So I would suggest that rather than have regard or even have due regard, a better duty might be to apply the principles and in relation to any associated policy statement to act in accordance with that. And then in terms of the breadth of the duty, rather than just applying to Scottish ministers, they should apply to all public authorities. And rather than just applying in the development of policy and legislation, they should apply across the piece whenever exercising relevant functions. And it's really crucial that the legal framing of that is got right so that they can continue, that's all it is, just continue to perform the role that they have been doing already.
Lloyd.
I agree with that and with much of what Campbell said earlier, but I just wanted to comment on a couple of things that Stuart said and also on your question about timing earlier. In terms of environmental courts, in arguing for environmental courts as part of long-term sort of governance arrangements, we often just say environmental courts and or tribunal. I think it's important that both are part of the court system with the Lord President at the apex, and the parallel with the Land Court and the Lands Tribunal is very pertinent, and in many of the potential analysis of how you might do it, it's actually been suggested that expanding the remit and the expertise of the Land Court and the Lands Tribunal might be a way of achieving an environmental court or tribunal. In other words, you call it a Land and Environment Court, which happens to be the name in some parts of Australia of the similar body. So I think, and I do think many of the issues could be resolved in a tribunal-like way by the Land and Environments Tribunal, if that becomes, before it goes to the court, and then, you know, ultimately through appeal processes could end up with the court session or whatever. The question on the parliamentary commissioner and who is the custodian of policy, I think no suggestion has ever been made that the watchdog, whatever it's called, is a custodian of policy. Policy is determined by the government oversight with parliamentary oversight. The commissioner's role is to scrutinise whether the various bits of government, both government itself and its agencies and local authorities and others, are complying with that policy. And whether or not they are complying in a way that's consistent with whatever international obligations the government has signed up to. And the Commissioner's role is to provide advice and oversight on whether those things are being carried out, not necessarily to determine the policy. I mean, it may be able, on the basis of its investigations, give advice on what future policy may or may not, what would be potentially good and potentially harmful to the policy objectives, but a custodian of policy rests with the government, and the Commissioner's role is one of oversight and the ability to investigate and respond to citizens' concerns. On the question of timing, I think the crucial date, I think, is the end of the year, so the end of any transition periods that we get into, and that's why I think it's very welcome that the government have committed, if possible, to put legislation related to principles and governance in the continuity bill that's in the programme for government. I think it's important that that happens. It's important that it's as strong as possible in the way that Hattie described. But I think it also ought to at least flag up, if not start to deliver, the statutory underpinning for the strategy and the legally binding targets that Sheila talked about. And I think a commitment to legally binding targets is I think, absolutely fundamental to ensuring that we move on that path towards an ambitious recovery. It's worth pointing out that the UK Environment Bill does include that. Some mechanism of environmental targets, and all parties at Westminster are supporting those targets for the UK government in relation to England. And it seems to me that it would be odd not to seek to set our own targets for Scotland.
Joanna.
Thank you. Just to pick up on the duty to have regard, again, the weakening of the obligation by moving towards a duty to have regard to the environmental principles, what will actually happen in practice is that developments will get consented in Scotland that would not be consented under the current regime. So you'll get projects going up that there'll be objections to them, people will be happy about it. But if that is weakened, if the obligations regarding those principles is weakened, that's what will happen. And in the case of the English system versus the Scottish system, there may be, if one is easier to get a project consented in one jurisdiction, then the developers will look at that jurisdiction. So there may be an imbalance generated there. One very good example of that at the minute is we're very, development can be very, very restricted under the Habitats Directive. Where there's even a chance that there might be an effect on a Natura site, so a site that has been designated as a special area of conservation or a special protection area under the Habitats Directive or Wild Birds Directive, if there's even a chance of an effect either on the ecology of that site or on the species that use that site, there has to be a Habitats Regulations appraisal done. And as any developer who's had to do an HRA will tell you, it is very, very difficult to get beyond that test. It's a very strict test. It's a test of beyond reasonable scientific doubt of a significant adverse effect. So it's a very, very tight test. Now, there is a public interest option also provided for in the Habitat Regulations, but it's rarely used in the UK. I know that it is used in other member states. I have spoken to lawyers in other countries who've said that if they can't get a development through the Habitats Directive requirements, they will just use the public interest option. But that doesn't happen in the UK at the minute. So we have this very, very, very tight test to get through where there is a protected site. And in the future, if there's not more than just a duty to have a regard to those principles, there's a chance that that will get weakened and we'll see developments actually being built that actually shouldn't be because of the impact on the environment.
Okay, I'm going to come to Bridget, then Vicky, and then we've got a question from Mark.
Thank you. Just on environmental court, I think SEPA would agree with Campbell that we need to get the rest of the system right and then see where that leaves us with the environmental court. So as a matter of practicality, we have appeals that go to the land court in relation to enforcement measures. We have a lot of cases that go through the criminal courts, and we have a few judicial reviews against us in the civil courts. But in all of those courts, the most important thing is that the judge has knowledge, is specialist, and is supported to make good decisions. And that's perhaps a weakness of the current system that we could address. So I think, in a way, SEPA is quite ambivalent about structure and whether an environmental court is needed, but that there is a need to perhaps bolster up the experience and expertise of our judiciary across the three forums that we see cases go to. But in terms of the principles, I think my understanding of the principles and how they apply currently is slightly different from Hattie's. And I did see this appear in Annalise's document from SPICE, and I've heard it, I've seen it in other documents, and I've checked with my Environment Agency colleagues. But as far as we are concerned, the principles apply currently to the legislative policy-making functions rather than administrative individual decision-making functions. That's not to say that, as a matter of practice, we don't have regard to them when making decisions, but they're fed down through to regulators through the legislation, which takes account of the principles. So actually, when we're making our individual decisions, we don't actually have to have regard as a matter of law to those principles now. That's the current situation. So the rolling over of that would be a similar thing that is applied to the legislation-making functions of the government rather than the admin decision-making functions of the regulator. But just to add some colour to this point, the way in which we make decisions is extremely complex under the legislation. We have layers and layers of duties that we're taking into account. And just as an example, in the first place, we have to do everything within the context of our statutory purpose, which requires us to protect the environment primarily, but then to have regard to health and well-being and sustainable economic growth. So that's a framework within which all our functions are exercised. Then under the legislation, under the individual bits of legislation, we have to, in making a decision, weigh up a number of factors which are quite often competing, and there's a lot of complexity around it. So I just took an example under Reg 15 of CAR, which is a controlled environment regulations, Scotland, regulations for water. We have to consider, in determining an application, the risk to the water environment, other users of the water environment. We need to consider the steps taken to ensure efficient and sustainable water use, and we have to consider the impact on groundwater. So once we've done that, we then have to consider other statutory duties under the Water Environment and Water Services Scotland Act, and we have to have regard to 5 things under that, which include social and economic impact of exercising the functions, promoting sustainable flood risk management, acting in the best way to contribute to achievement of sustainable development, and adopt an integrated approach by cooperating with other responsible authorities and Scottish ministers. Then we have another layer of general statutory duties in other acts. So we have to further the conservation of biodiversity, and we have to contribute to delivery of emissions reduction targets. And in a way, we consider this to be done in a most sustainable way. And then finally, we tend to take a step back because we have to and consider any impact on the human rights of an individual. So in all of that, there's a huge complexity and a huge amount of things that we're weighing. And at the same time, we will consider those environmental principles. We don't have to as a matter of law, but certainly the precautionary principle quite often comes into play when we're making individual decisions. So we are concerned about the complexity of the decision-making and whether actually applying those principles to the admin functions of our actual regulatory decision actually would make us make any different decision or actually have any sort of purpose, because it's all already included in that long list of things we have to consider and has been filtered down through to us. So in a way, it just adds another layer of complexity for us. We do have policy-making functions in addition to those regulatory decision-making functions, and I think there is an argument that the principles should filter through the legislation and apply to our policy-making function. And so we're in discussions with Scottish Government about how that could be achieved in a way that makes it straightforward for us. But as a matter of practice, again, we would consider those principles when considering and developing our policies. All our policies are based on those principles in any event. So I just thought that was helpful for clarity. Vicky?
I just wanted to come back to a point that's been made a couple of times now in terms of the statutory underpinning of the environment strategy and why that's so important, and to give an example. So whether that's through the continuity bill or a separate specific piece of legislation, an environment bill, and we fix those legally binding targets, it's really important because we've seen before in Scottish law requirements to bring forward strategies which then are not implemented and have no effect. And the example I would use is the land use strategy. So the original Climate Change Act set out a requirement to lay before Parliament a land use strategy. RSPB Scotland and many Link members are very supportive of the strategy that we have and the principles and objectives in that, but there's been no implementation of it. It's had no effect on other areas of policy in very many cases because there is no legally binding underpinning of that to make it implementable. So it's only now, a decade later from that, that we're actually starting to see some movement with the establishment of now regional partnerships and regional land use frameworks. So I think we absolutely need to avoid that kind of mistake and be clear about what Scotland's environmental ambitions are and put that on a statutory footing and then set out the plans and the funding that's actually going to deliver that. I'll stop there. I mean, I've got some more points about what we might want to see in that strategy, but I don't know whether other members have questions that we might come back to.
Well, we can come back to that. I mean, I'm just watching the clock. We've got about 15 minutes left for our discussion. I'm going to go to Mark, who's been waiting to ask a question for ages, but Sheila, I'll put you first on the list. Yeah, Mark, if you want to go ahead.
I've got too many questions now, but I'll pick one. I was struck by the points that were made about non-regression being linked to environmental outcomes, and I was also struck by the point made about how an Environment Commissioner should potentially have powers to consider the merit of certain decisions and not just whether a due process has been followed. And I wonder if there was any more comments about the role of an Environment Commissioner and how that would work. I mean, I'm also struck by the Future Generations Commissioner in Wales and some of the dynamics around the decision on the M4 in Wales. And I'm just, because it's an interesting space. You have a body which is effectively a watchdog, but it's also providing an independent assessment of government decisions, which are kind of outside of legal duty, but are much more about that strategy and that vision. So how does that work in practice? Are there good examples of where such a kind of watchdog goes a bit beyond just whether a due process has been followed or not?
Lloyd, and then I'll come to Campbell.
Yeah, I think the key thing there is to what extent is the Commissioner an advisory body in a way that, say, the Children's and Young People Commissioner is, or whether or not it has powers in the way that the Information Commissioner, for instance, has powers to enforce or instruct government and agencies to provide information when requested. And I think if you are going to seek to fill a gap that's left by the loss of the European institutions, then a watchdog body, whether it's headed by a commissioner or a group of commissioners or whatever, that's kind of, but the body needs to be both. It needs to be, as I said right at the beginning, it needs to be independent of government, and therefore that is the emphasis on it being parliamentary in a way that the Information and other commissioners are. And it needs to be empowered. And it needs to be empowered to be able to be free and frank in the advice it gives, and it needs to be empowered to be able to respond to citizens' complaints in a way that sees that they can be addressed, you know, by being empowered to ask for information and make comments on that information. And ultimately, as a last resort, to be able to refer any examples of sort of inappropriate actions to court. That doesn't mean that every case goes all the way through. There will be very few cases that go all the way through to a court-type showdown at the end of the day. And that is the case with many European issues. They are resolved much earlier on in the process. They may be resolved simply by informal phone calls from officials, between officials and the European Commission. They may be resolved by a formal letter from the European Commission, or in our future case, a parliamentary commissioner to the government or to an agency. And, you know, the examples that Nick quoted were not the result of court decisions. They were the result of far earlier informal processes that resulted in changes in direction domestically. And that's the kind of role that I think a parliamentary commissioner should have. It needs to be kind of advisory and empowered. And in order to do that, obviously, the third buzzword that I used earlier is resources. And those resources aren't only money, although money is necessary, but it's expertise. And it's expertise both in environmental matters and in sort of the legal interpretations and so on, so that it's well informed. I think the key thing, you talked about merits. I think all of what the Commission does obviously needs to deal with the merits, but at the moment, if a commissioner existed and it referred it to an issue to the existing domestic courts, then that would only be under a sort of judicial review system, and merits are not part of the assessment there, and that's one of the key issues about Aarhus compliance in Scotland, and one of the arguments for, I think, as Bridget pointed out, the arguments for informed judiciary and court systems, potentially with expert assessors assisting the judge, which is kind of the way in which environmental courts in other jurisdictions work, is important, because one of the key aspects of the Aarhus rights is that citizens have a right to review, independent judicial review of decisions, not only on process points, but on merits as well.
Campbell and then Hattie.
Okay, thank you very much. My research certainly showed that there are several different kinds of commissioner model, and looking at the Future Generations model in Wales, and there was a similar model in Hungary, and also looking at various commissioners in Canada, both at state and province level as well as at the Dominion level. They are very variable, but they have one thing in common, in that if they're not adequately designed and adequately protected, they are vulnerable to falling out with, using the shorthand, the government of the day, and therefore being disempowered in some shape or form. Where there were First Nation issues in Ontario, and the Commissioner came out on the wrong side as far as the incoming new government was concerned, they found themselves emasculated almost immediately and turned into effectively a quantitative audit body, which had no longer any responsibilities to look at the substance of the case. A very similar thing has happened at the federal level there. I think I really homed in on New Zealand as an example because the skills of the succession of post holders and their locus as independent but very strongly tied to the Parliament officers meant that, or has meant thus far, that they have been able to be effective irrespective of the government of the day. They've commanded respect, they've had authoritative technical support, etc. But I also, in my report, the Link report, pointed out that these are necessary but not sufficient conditions to ensure that the environment itself is protected adequately in the longer term, because there is still a need to have a strategy that is being robustly implemented by all of the parties and that they're held accountable for that, and that can ultimately be policed through a court-type system if everything else fails. But for me, the merits of a parliamentary commissioner outweigh the disadvantages of the weak versions that we've seen, and they are versions of the Commission, the European Commission itself, because they do have the ability to receive complaints, to investigate, to scrutinise, to receive data, to opine on data, to inform policy, etc. So I think it may be asking a lot of a commissioner to play those various roles, but effectively Audit Scotland is playing that within a financial and a non-financial domain at the moment. And it was interesting when I interviewed Audit Scotland, they took the view that they could see an exact parallel, but they simply didn't have the resources to be able to take on that role, and it would then subsequently distort their locus and their deployment if that was one of the things they focused on, but they didn't focus on transport in the same way, or whatever it happened to be. But I think the combination of those skilled resources, as Lloyd was suggesting, it's not just money, but it's about the talent and the experience that's accessible to them, the powers that they have, the transparent access and affordable access to the citizenry. I think these are fundamental components of what a good commissioner looks like. But it's very important that committees like this one and Parliament design this in a robust way so that it can operate safely, independent of the tides of the day, because clearly governments and other parties within an administration can apply pressures that could knock the independent view off course if there are not protections around that. Protections not just for the Commissioner, but for the citizenry at large and thus the environment.
Hattie?
Just very quickly on the principles point, this might be an issue which the committee wants to come back to in follow-up, and in doing so, I just wanted to draw attention quickly to an article by Professors Morelli and Eloise Scotford, in which their view of the principles perhaps differs slightly from Bridget's, but they explain that the environmental principles are binding on all public authorities when they're applying EU law, in all relevant cases, including administrative decisions. So there's appears to be a difference of opinion there, but I'd be happy to share that article with you so you can take a look at it and form your own view afterwards.
I'm happy to have that sent on to us. Nick, you wanted to come in on this?
Yes, I just wanted to stand back a little and make a slightly broader point. The discussion so far has quite understandably focused quite a lot on compliance, and it's really important that we get that right. But if we're going to succeed, compliance alone isn't enough. We've already recognised that. And it strikes me that there are many routes to success, but working with business is going to be absolutely key. They are key emitters, they are key managers of the land, they are key generators of the wealth that pays for all of this. You know, they are an absolutely key stakeholder in all of this. And so it's really a plea to make sure that their voice is heard in this whole debate, because the question I would want to ask them is, what support do you in business, whether you're a farming business, whether you are a processor, whatever you are, what support do you need to make the next 10, 15, 20 years a success, both in reducing your emissions, but in ensuring a nature-rich future for our country? Because we can't just be talking to them about compliance, because that is, whilst important, a really negative thing. If we're really going to be successful, we need all of them to be working for success. And that is Bridget's point, going beyond compliance. And what support do they need beyond being told what not to do, but to do the right thing? Because my experience of talking to business is that the mood has changed really fundamentally over the last couple of years. It's no longer what can we get away with. There's a real realization that the business opportunity lies in going beyond compliance as a nation, as individual businesses. But what we haven't yet caught up with is how the whole system, whether it's incentives, advice, or regulation, or the court system, hasn't really caught up with how they can be helped to do it.
I'm just conscious we've got 3 minutes left, and if anybody wanted to make any points around anything that we've talked about today, now is your chance. I know that Sheila, George, I cut you off earlier in another theme before I allowed Mark in. Sheila.
It was still on principles, if that's all right. So I think robust application of the principles is a protective measure for government and for agencies as well. And one example of that would be the Scottish Coal case in 2013. They went into liquidation. If they had been allowed to walk away from that site, it would have been left causing environmental damage, degradation. They wouldn't have been responsible for it. Scottish Government or the local authorities would have had to pick up the bill. And application of the polluter pays principle ensured that liquidators had to continue to manage that site and carry the costs. So yes, there is a burden in application of these principles, but it's also incredibly protective, and it's a bottom line. So it's important that the application is robust.
Annalisa.
One final point on principles. I second what was said, and this is really mainstream interpretation of the value and role of principles in EU law. We are now in a situation where we are moving away from that design, which prompts us to think what they have done in the context of governance that we experience here in Scotland. And clearly, this is an issue that needs to be looked at moving forward. whatever we think of a present value and for all of these principles, what will we use for next? So this is one of the many questions that are up for discussion in Scotland. And I should have said in the beginning that whatever I've been saying in this evidence session is in my personal capacity, not as Spice Fellow.
If there's no other points, yeah, Vicky.
Quickly, just to come back and pick up on what Nick was saying about sort of, thinking about where do we want to go. It's not just about compliance, absolutely. But I think we'd all recognise that most, if not all, businesses are ultimately dependent on the natural environment in one form or another. It's the assets on which they use to produce food or timber or whatever else. And actually what we need to be looking in that sort of 10 or 20 or even longer time frame are some really key things where we're not actually doing very well. The State of Nature report is very clear that biodiversity is declining. We've got some big problems. We should be setting out our stall in that strategy, and we do need to bring it forward really quickly, which I think was Campbell's point. We've wasted quite a lot of time. We should be setting out how nature can help us meet those climate targets. What are we going to do about native woodland expansion, peatland restoration, coastal and marine habitats? We have targets for peatland restoration, but actually it's only about we're going to restore a third of the 650,000 hectares of degraded peatland. But actually if we made a commitment to restoring all of that and working out how to do it, that would take us a long way to meeting our climate targets. We need to improve our protected areas in Scotland, our designated sites, which in many cases are already in unfavourable condition and failing. We've got to do that. We could create a Scottish nature network that restores and connects habitats. We need to do things in our marine environments to stop overfishing and pollution. All these things connecting into the land use strategy and eradicate wildlife crime, which I know this committee has looked at on a number of occasions. So let's get that strategy, let's set that ambition, and let's be very clear about where Scotland wants to be to benefit those businesses actually that do depend on the natural environment.
Okay, that seems like a good note to end on. I want to thank you all this morning. Obviously this is a conversation that we'll continue to have. Nothing about today is over. It's been very helpful to have your input as we start 2020. That concludes the committee's business in public today. At its next meeting on the 21st of January 2020, the committee expects to take evidence on the report on the Grouse-Moor Management Group and to consider in private a draft of its Stage 1 report on the Animals and Wildlife Penalties, Protections and Powers Scotland Bill. We now move into private session and ask that the gallery be cleared as the public part of this meeting is now closed. Thank you.